Good evening. Welcome. My name is Edith LeMasters, and I'd like to welcome you here to Village Heights. We're so excited that you've come tonight to take time out of your busy day to enjoy some stories. First of all, I'd like to tell you where the restrooms are. There are two restrooms out here on the main floor out by the drinking fountain, down the little hallway. And if the lights are off, the lights are on the outside of the door. So you need to flip them on if they're not on. And there's two restrooms downstairs at the bottom of the stairs. We also have a bake sale going on, so if you don't like to bake, there's plenty of goodies out there. That's one thing that our congregation does well, is there's lots of super good bakers, and so there's some wonderful goodies out there. If you didn't get a chance to go out there before now, they'll be out there at the end of tonight's service program. We also have some goodies too, so we hope you stay and chat with everybody that's here. Let's see, what else do I need to say? Restrooms, bake sale. Oh, there's also t-shirts and all sorts of other things out here. So, so glad that you came tonight. And I think Barbara's next. Do you want me to say anything else? I'm kind of short and to the point. Oh, no, I couldn't.
Thank you, and thank you for being our gracious hostess tonight. How many of you have been to a Storytellers night before? Oh, well, then you're all veterans. Then I don't need to give an orientation as to what you're in for tonight. What we are doing is it's an evening of stories among friends. It's just going to be a fun night where we can all have the opportunity to share a story. We have three main storytellers tonight that are going to prime the pump for you. The theme tonight is a story to tell, women in Community of Christ history. So Lachlan and Carol Price and myself are going to share some stories about our favorite women in history, among our favorite women in history. And then we hope you have some women in history that you'd be willing to share a story or two about. What's exciting about this particular congregation is they put a lot of thought into this evening, and they geared up a bake sale just like women used to do for years to raise money for their congregation or for the stake or for particular projects way back when. They used to sell quilts and sell a lot of crafts in order to raise money for the faith community. I think when I saw that bake sale, I thought, let's fire up the old women's department and let's go. So tonight we're going to be sharing stories about women in church history. It's going to be an estrogen-inspiring night, so hold on to your hats. And who better to start us off with than Brother Mackay?
Yes, you
Never been introduced with estrogen before. I have chosen to talk this evening about Emma Hale Smith Bideman. Seems like we can't talk about women in church history without including Emma at some point. Little background on Emma. She was born in what was then called Harmony, Pennsylvania. If you have not yet visited Harmony, Pennsylvania, it is perhaps the newest historic site for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They've done a beautiful job of reconstructing Emma's childhood home that you see here, top left. Isn't it reminiscent of the mansion house in Nauvoo? Perhaps some inspiration drawn there. Emma's dad, Isaac Hale, was a hunter. I didn't think much about that, but when I got to this site, I discovered that he was supplying game to Europe, which is how he could afford that house. She grew up in a pretty nice surroundings. This, on the same property, is the little building that Emma and Joseph initially lived in. And it was at this site that Section 24 of the Doctrine and Covenants came in July of 1830. It's referred to often as the Elect Lady Revelation. Behold, thy sins are forgiven thee, and thou art an elect lady whom I have called, and thou, Emma, shalt be ordained under his," meaning Joseph's, "hand, to expound scriptures and to exhort the church according as it shall be given thee by my Spirit. For he shall lay his hands upon thee, and thou shalt receive the Holy Ghost, and thy time shall be given to writing and to learning much." So I was always kind of curious about that. Emma Smith ordained, section 24, Harmony, Pennsylvania. What does that mean? I always just kind of had this lingering question about that. We're going to jump to Emma in Nauvoo, a story that I'm guessing a lot of you have already heard, but it really illustrates something about Emma's character. When the Smiths first arrived in Nauvoo, they moved into a pre-existing structure. You see an image of it here, the homestead, it would later be called, right on the banks of the Mississippi River, which meant ground zero for malaria in Nauvoo. And something like 17% of the people who died in 1840s Nauvoo died of malaria. And the fall were the kind of the dying season. Joseph, in the fall of 39, had gone to Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. President Martin Van Buren and ask for help after being driven from Missouri. So Emma is left behind with the kids in Nauvoo. Malaria is raging through the community. Emma ends up taking in as many as 12 people sick with malaria. Now, it looks like a nice big house, but at the time it was only the log section, which means 2 rooms, maybe 12 by 12, one down, one up. So 2 rooms, 12 people she's trying to nurse back to health. So crowded in there that she has to move her family into a tent in the yard to make room for the sick. Emma, a wonderful example of abolishing poverty and ending needless suffering. Speaking of suffering, some of the stories that I'm going to tell tonight might be a little painful. I have friends who are coming from religious traditions where our leaders have been revered, really almost placed on a pedestal. And sometimes when they have discovered more difficult parts of our story, it has been devastating for them. And they reject not just their faith home, but faith and the idea that there could be a God. So it's either true or false, good or evil, black or white. I believe that the life takes place in the gray for us and for our ancestors. And so some of the stories might be a little uncomfortable. We'll see. This one is not. Emma and the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo. The Relief Society is organized 17 March of 1842. They initially meet upstairs in the red brick store in what was called the Lodge Room. It's the room that Joseph had been introduced to Freemasonry in just a few weeks before. The point of the Relief Society was to find work for the widows and food for the poor. They start their organizational meeting by singing the Spirit of God. Joseph then proposed that if any officers are wanted to carry out the designs of the institution, let them be appointed and set apart as deacons, teachers, and etc. are among us. This comes from the Nauvoo Female Relief Society minutes, which have only been available in recent years. Joseph said that the sisters should elect a presiding officer to preside over them, and let that presiding officer choose 2 counselors to assist in the duties of her office, that he would ordain them to preside over the society, and let them preside just as the presidency preside over the church. They then unanimously selected Emma to be their presiding officer or president. Joseph then read section 24 regarding Emma Smith and stated that she had been ordained back in 1830 in Harmony. Ordained at the time the revelation was given to expound the scriptures to all and to teach the female part of the community, and that not she alone but others may attain to the same blessings. Emma's counselors were then ordained. Now, this is a little confusing. Is it an ordination? Is it setting apart? I don't think we're clear. They're using the language ordain, not to a priesthood office, but it does seem that priesthood authority was conveyed. Because Joseph would later say that he was turning the key to the Relief Society. Now, key in this context means authority. And that gets a little uncomfortable later as our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ are working on the church history. I turn the key to you becomes I turn the key on your behalf. Just close. Women in Nauvoo in the 1840s are offering healing blessings, what we would call administrations. And as you can guess, some of the men complain about it. And Joseph's response was, well, does it work? Well, yeah. Okay, then. At the time, blessings were given to the afflicted part. So, and women in 1840s Nauvoo were administering to other women and children primarily. And so, for example, with matters related to childbirthing, they would bless the afflicted part, the stomach. Later, and I don't know when, I'd like to figure this out, we switch and just lay the hands on the head no matter what. Here's a tough one. I don't know whether to laugh or cry about this story. I believe that plural marriage is secretly introduced in Nauvoo in the 1840s. Let me be clear that I believe you can also build a compelling case that Joseph had nothing to do with it. You can also build a compelling case that he did have something to do with it. I land in the middle. I think he was involved, but prior to his death, he decided it was a mistake and was trying to get it stopped. We welcome all of those diverse opinions in the church. But there is an account that says that Hiram Smith, Joseph's brother, was opposed to plural marriage, but that Brigham Young, I like to blame Brigham, don't we always want to blame Brigham? Brigham did it. Brigham Young convinced Hiram that it was of God. And Hiram believed that if Joseph would just have a revelation, he could take it to Emma and convince her. Joseph says, I don't think so, Hiram. I don't think so. Oh, yes, I'm pretty sure. And so this account goes that in this room, this is a reconstruction of the red brick store. So in Joseph's office in the red brick store, according to this account, Joseph writes, William Clayton, the scribe, records it. They hand this revelation, quote, revelation to Hiram. He heads off to the homestead to see Emma. Hiram quickly returns and says, I have never had a worse talking to in all my life. Again, really painful. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I do a little bit of both. Another one that's a little challenging. Joseph Smith III tells this story in his memoirs. So Emma has gone to St. Louis to buy furniture for the mansion house, the Smiths' new hotel. She comes back and discovers that Joseph has allowed Porter Rockwell, kind of this infamous outlaw that we, for some reason, love, despite the terrible things that he would do, to install a bar in this room in the mansion. Emma gets home, makes this discovery. She sends little Joseph up to the front of the house to get his dad, so there's no public scene. Invites Joseph to the back of the house so they can discuss this. And Emma says, Joseph, you know, you're the president of a religious organization. You're raising your children in this environment. Do you really think this is a good idea? And Joseph says, it's just temporary. I'm just trying to help out my good friend Porter. He's been in jail in Missouri on our behalf. Just trying to help him out. It's temporary. And Emma says, well, okay, if you want to keep it, that's fine. But I'm taking the children and moving back across the street. Moving back to the homestead, their first Nauvoo home. I think we know how the story turned out, because about a month before Joseph's killed, Josiah Quincy and Charles Adams, son and grandson of U.S. presidents, visit Nauvoo, visit Joseph, tour the mansion. They say of this room, it was the most comfortless bar room I have ever seen. all the more comfortless because it was dry. Emma wins. I like to think that this story relates to Josiah Quincy and Charles Adams, those politicians, but we're not sure. We just know that this story is about a couple of politicians who visit unexpectedly Joseph and Emma in Nauvoo. Emma quickly has to pull together dinner and dessert. For dessert, she fries dough and serves it with honey. One of the visitors, one of the unexpected callers says, "Well, Mrs. Smith, this is delicious. What do you call it?" "A candidate," she said. "A candidate? Why, yes, because it's all puffed up and full of hot air." That was the grandchildren's favorite story about their grandmother Emma. They tell that over and over and over again. Joseph, of course, was killed June 27 of 1844. Things calmed down in Nauvoo for a little while, but then it starts to get a little hectic again. The Latter-day Saints continued to vote in elections, and their non-Latter-day Saint neighbors thought that they shouldn't. And so the violence kicks up again eventually. So by February of 46, many of the folks in Nauvoo are heading west with the Exodus. Thousands eventually leave, maybe 7,000. There are still some remaining in Nauvoo, though, and those who were trying to push the Latter-day Saints out thought that they had an agreement that everybody should go. And so, and I don't use the term mob lightly, but a group that I would have to call a mob comes in September of 1846 with cannons to drive the last of the Latter-day Saints from Nauvoo. We are fighting back. We're joined with what are called new citizens, non-Latter-day Saints, who've moved into Nauvoo to buy empty homes and businesses. They join the remaining Latter-day Saints. We're fighting back with makeshift cannons. We lose. As part of the surrender agreement, every remaining Latter-day Saint had to go. Now, Emma had fled with her children as that battle is breaking out. She jumps on the steamboat Toby and steams upriver to Fulton, Illinois. William Marks, state president in Nauvoo, later part of the presidency in the reorganization, but he was in Fulton, as were other church members, so it was a safe place for her. But eventually she discovered that the person who was leasing her hotel back in Nauvoo was preparing to steal all her furniture as soon as the river thawed and he could load it on the flatboat and sail south. So one account says, quotes Emma as saying, "I have no friend left but God and no place to go but home." And so after 5 months in Fulton, she returns to Nauvoo, throws out the person trying to steal her furniture, moves back in, and basically lives out her life on the intersection of Main and Water in Nauvoo, and bounces around between a few different homes, but lives out her life there. Now, while Emma was in Fulton, she had received a letter from a man named Louis Bideman. He was one of those new citizens. You see Louis here. And he had been a leader of those fighting to defend us, to defend the remaining Latter-day Saints. He wrote Emma and asked her if his brother might be able to rent the Mansion House Hotel. And she had responded and said, "It's already rented." But that seems to be the beginning of the relationship that would eventually lead to marriage. But one of my favorite Emma and Louis courting stories goes as follows. Louis is pretty dapper, kind of a fancy dresser. So he comes calling. Emma is up on the second story of one of the homes. Little Joseph is there with her. It's Joseph, I think, who describes this. Louis sees Emma. He's always wearing that top hat. Takes off his top hat, does a really stiff, formal bow, which I would do, except my back is out. On the way back up, he runs into a clothesline and knocks off his toupee. Emma married him anyway. When you read read their letters, there's clearly love in the relationship, but like most relationships, there were challenges at times as well. And one of the challenges was that there was a loose step in the mansion house on the way to the cellar. You see a photograph of the mansion house, the cellar, the back behind. And Emma had to carry the milk every day down those steps with this loose tread. And she asked Lewis to fix it. Now, he was pretty talented in many ways. He could have easily fixed it. He didn't. And this clearly went on for some time. Eventually, Emma's solution was to go to the top of the steps with the day's milk, toss the milk to the bottom of the stairs, and tell Lewis that the step needed fixing. He fixed it that day. This is another painful one. Emma, as we've talked about, is a huge fan of monogamy. But when she is 59, Lewis has an affair and fathers a child. After about 4 years, Nancy, the mother, came to Emma and explained that she was impoverished and not able to care for the little boy. And she asked Emma if she would take Charlie in and raise him. And she did. She's not going to punish the little boy for the indiscretions of the father. And apparently, the Vitamin family tradition is that on Emma's deathbed, Emma asked Lewis if he would marry Nancy following her death so that Charlie would continue to have both a father and a mother. And Lewis did. As Emma is getting up in years, Alexander Smith, one of the Smith's children, writes to his stepdad, Lewis, and says, "Hey, if you're still interested in building a small cottage for Emma that might have fewer steps than a mansion house and be easier to care for, I would like to help." Well, you see a picture of the result, a massive brick structure built out of the remnants of the Nauvoo house. Was going to be a huge hotel. Does not have fewer steps, not easier to care for, but Emma did have, for the last 8 years of her life, a nice new home. They called it the Riverside Mansion when Emma lived there, because there was already, somebody had taken the name Nauvoo House in Nauvoo and called that, another hotel, that name. So Emma lived out the last 8 years of her life in the Riverside Mansion, often called the Nauvoo House. It was there that she died in 1879. Apparently, one account says that right before Emma passed, she is calling out, "Joseph, Joseph, I'm coming." We don't know if that's Joseph III in the next room that she's calling, or Joseph Jr. in the hereafter. But her final words, apparently, "Joseph, Joseph, I'm coming." You see Emma's cenotaph, an above-ground empty tomb with Joseph. Actually, this is Vida E. Smith, I think one of Alexander's children, visiting her grandmother's grave with her husband, Heman C. Smith. It's often been said that we are Emma's church. Emma's church. Now, historically, that's not quite accurate. We're up and going by 1852, 53, what was called the New Organization, and eventually the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now Community of Christ. Emma doesn't join us until 1860. So historically, not really accurate, but I gotta say, I claim with honor the title of Emma's church.
if that didn't say Audrey Stubbart above it, would any of you that have been born and raised around here have recognized her? Because I certainly didn't. That picture was found in the Temple Library, and they emailed it to me, and I didn't have a clue for a minute who it was. But that was Audrey in the early years. Audrey was born in 1895, and she was born in a cabin on a farm that was rented by her parents, and it was in Nebraska. And her parents lived in 10 different places in 10 years. I think one of the things that amazed me about Audrey, and the reason I chose her, was I was blessed to have worshiped with her and known her the last 5 years of her life, because she attended the New Walnut Park congregation. But the thing that amazed me was she was born the exact same year my father-in-law was, in the same part of Nebraska, and he lived to be 101. So I'm thinking, whatever they did in that part of Nebraska, it was good. But Audrey grew up in poverty. But when you look at, if you go through a card shop, a gift shop, especially in a tourist area, you know how they have the birthday cards that tell you what happened in the year you were born? Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but you can't find one that says 1895, okay? So I decided to kind of create my own. In the first place, Grover Cleveland was the president. The Oklahoma wasn't a state. Graceland College was founded that year. The Daughters of the American Revolution was created that year. And no one had walked on the moon yet. The atom had not been split. It was an entirely different world that Audrey was born into. But she was taught mostly at home. Her mother used like milk cartons or wooden crates for a desk, and she got her beginning education that way. And even as much as she always loved Graceland, she never was able to attend there because she was married at 15 years old. She married John Stubbart, and in the early years, they lived in Lamoni. And he was a marshal there. But his father was a 70 in the church, a missionary, and he told him, he'd heard this exciting new thing, you could get free ground, free land if you just went to Wyoming. So he went. He took the cattle. You got to maintain your priorities. He had his cattle. The wife and the kids were back home, but he took the cattle, and he got 320 acres. She followed him by train with the kids. They had 5, and they built a log cabin on this piece of ground, and she raised her kids. She helped with the ranch. She plowed. She helped lift the bale. She herded sheep. Whatever needed to be done, they did it together. But while she was being a mother, being a rancher, she would spend time in her kitchen ironing and studying. She brought the books she had that she'd had to quit doing at 15, and she brought those books with her. And John's dad had been a teacher before he was called to the office of 70, so he had textbooks that he also contributed. And Audrey began studying. It says that she memorized grammar books. Oh my gosh, it must have been boring in Wyoming. But she did that, and she educated herself, and then she went to the University of Wyoming to take a test. She took that test, and they gave her a teaching certificate on the spot. So she goes back to the ranch, and she starts a school for the community around her. There weren't any schools, so now besides being a wife, a mother, and a rancher, she's a school teacher. But the part that really blew my mind is if you were ever around Audrey, she was so prim and proper in the suits and the hat, and the hats always had a beautiful hat pin on them. I used to sit in church and admire them, I remember. But she always looked like that all the years I knew her. So I was really surprised to find out that she also was a midwife in Wyoming, because there weren't any. And the one that really got me is she prepared bodies for burial because there was no undertaker either. And I cannot imagine the Audrey I knew preparing bodies for burial, but she did. So she just did everything that could be imagined that seemed to need to be done. And then in 1944, her and John decided they just didn't want to spend the rest of their life out on the prairie. So they came to Independence, and they bought a house in walking distance of what is now New Walnut Park, over on 23rd Street. And that's when her independence journey began. She worked for the Herald Bookstore, but back then they did this thing that I can't even hardly say without it affecting me. Mandatory retirement. And I feel about it just like Audrey did, and she was very outspoken about the way she felt about it. She told people how it just wasted gifts and talents if people were told they couldn't use them after age 65. But a lot of places did that back then, and so she retired. And that's when the Independence Examiner reached out to her. And they offered her a job as a proofreader. But they had no idea how many years she was going to hold down that job. But she did proofreading for the Independence Examiner. Well, John died in 1965 of a heart attack, and she stayed in the two-story White House on 23rd Street, just west of where the Hy-Vee sits now, and she stayed there the rest of her life. She attended New Walnut Park. She became very, very active in World Church. She helped rewrite or work on the Book of Mormon in the 60s. And she just was an amazing lady. I can remember sitting next to her on a midweek service, you know, at the Wednesday night prayer meetings where there's more opportunities for the congregation to share. And I'd sit there beside her. And as old as I am, you have to imagine I was half her age at the time. And she would quote scripture, exactly. She would quote poetry, and I would sit there and think, I can't remember what I had for lunch today. She just was this together. And her hat and her little suit, and she always sat on the south side of the sanctuary, second pew. And somebody, and they still remain nameless, nobody knows who did it, but somebody mentioned to Audrey that she probably shouldn't wear a hat when she sang in the choir. So she just said then she wouldn't be singing in the choir. And whoever that person was backed down instantly. Trust me, she never missed a Sunday singing in the choir. So that was Audrey. And this week, as I drove up and down 23rd Street and noticed the house, something suddenly occurred to me. My husband and I took her home from church periodically, and you would drive in the drive was at the back of the house. She'd go in like a kitchen door. And you'd take her up. My husband would pull in the driveway. She'd get out. We'd say, okay, we'll see you next Sunday. Nobody thought to help her in. She didn't have a walker. She didn't have a cane. And it didn't occur to me till this week she was 100 years old when we did that. You'd have thought somebody had the decency to help her in the house, wouldn't you? Didn't occur to us. Anyway, okay, so John has passed. Audrey's working. She's getting more involved in everything. The church, the community. She goes to different places and speaks to groups. She taught Bible school one year at New Walnut Park, and she took the oldest kids attending there, and she taught them the proper way to interview somebody. And once they interviewed these people and wrote it out, then she had pull at the Examiner, so she took them up there and got it printed in a newsletter. And they had produced this newsletter all by themselves. Well, she also taught Sunday school at New Walnut Park. And I found out a few weeks ago, somebody I bet everybody in the room knows was one of her students. He happens to be our Mission Center president, and at the end of February, when he retires, he'll have worked for the church for 40 years. Well, he sat in Audrey's Sunday school class in junior high, okay? So she had a lasting influence on the kids. I was told that a friend of mine whose son is probably in his close to 40 now, that at one time he thought maybe he just didn't want to go to New Walnut Park anymore. Just maybe he didn't. He wasn't sure where he wanted to go, but he maybe didn't want to go here. So his mom told him, take a pencil and paper and write down on this paper the names of people that you think you would miss being around and they would miss seeing you there. Audrey made that list. He listed Audrey on there, and I'm still mad that I didn't make the cut. But she had that kind of influence on the kids. But that also was the only negative thing she ever said to me about her age, was kids would tend to come up and run up and hug me. And she explained to me one Sunday how much she missed that. But as she got older and she was so small, she thought they were afraid they were going to hurt her, so that they didn't really hug her. So it kind of made me think, we need to keep that touch. We need to keep showing that compassion and love. Okay, can we see Locke? Can we see Audrey the way we recognize her? There we go. Most of you'd recognize that Audrey. And she continued for 34 years. If you ever were married, engaged, divorced, convicted of a crime, got an award for anything, made the honor roll, then in 34 years in eastern Jackson County, Audrey Stubbert read it and checked it. That's how much she was involved. She was interviewed by people everywhere. She met people everywhere. Charlton Heston was one of her favorite people. She'd seen him in the Ten Commandments. And she's got a picture all over in one of the papers of her and Charlton Heston. And when she got through with him and he went back to Hollywood, why, he sent her a whole bunch of stuff like pictures and autographs and stuff. He just really, everybody fell for Audrey. I've got to tell you about one of the first times I remember ever preaching, when Audrey was in her pew right here. And I was really new at that. And I looked there and I saw Audrey and I thought, oh my gosh, she's proofreading me. And when you stand in the back and, you know, people line up and come through, and that's really an awkward thing to do anyway. And she walks up to me and she says, where did you learn to do that? And I thought, whoa, I've got the Audrey seal of approval. I'm okay. I'm going to make it. As I researched Audrey this last few weeks, and I realized that she had read the Bible totally through at age 4 for the first time, and she had actually ended up as an adult proofreading the Bible, and she decided that there's a scripture where Paul in the Bible says convicted, and she's sure it should have said convinced, So she thought she found an error in the Bible. And I got to tell you, I'm really glad I didn't know that story when I was doing my first sermon standing there looking at her, because I'd have really been intimidated then. But she wrote weekly and daily articles for the Examiner. And she had a philosophy that the world will change, but virtues don't. The world will change, but virtues don't. She was 100 years old, going great guns, and they came along with a computer system. And that's the time she actually considered retiring. But it was okay. She figured it out. She figured it out, and she stayed. She wasn't intimidated. And I really appreciate that, because you notice Locke's pushing buttons for me, so you can tell how intimidated I am. But she just was going constantly. Then that was the first major health issue. She needed a pacemaker. I remember my husband and I discussing the fact, don't you think 103 is a little old to get a pacemaker? But she got a pacemaker at the Independence Sanitarium. And I remember Jerry and I went to visit her. And as we walked in the door, she says, I wish you'd have got here just a little earlier. I'd like to have had you meet my daughter. Her daughter had driven in from Iowa, and Audrey was kind of worried because she had to drive home on the interstate, and she's hoping she's safe, and she's hoping she doesn't have any problem getting home. And from there, she goes on to tell me that there's a lot of stuff in her house, like most of us have, that needed to be sorted through and passed down to this particular daughter. But she's waiting until the daughter gets old enough that she's sure she'll take care of it and be responsible. Now, Audrey was 103, and I just couldn't resist. I says, how old is she, Audrey? And she says, 86. My husband and I looked at each other and thought, don't do it, not in the room, wait till you get outside. But Audrey was just that kind of an amazing person. 5 days after the pacemaker was put in, she was back at the Examiner working. 40 hours a week, 5 days a week. I was in the auditorium, and I hope I don't take your story. I hope you didn't want to share it. I was in the temple in the library, and I came out, and Dr. Throw was there at the visitor's desk where he is so much of the time. And we talked about what I was doing, and he shared a story with me. His daughter had been in China on a missionary trip, and she was teaching. Okay, in Taiwan. All right. And there we saw all these articles about Audrey in newspapers around here, but she found an article, a Chinese daily newspaper, that was about this lady who lived in this place, who was over 100 years old and working full time. And she brought the newspaper back to her father. So what we're saying here is she wasn't a local celebrity. She was a national celebrity. Well, 5 weeks before her 105th birthday, she fell. And she never was able to go back to work after that. That was what slowed her down at 105. But she also had to move out of her home about that time. And she was over at the Groves. And Jerry and I went again to visit. And I noticed there was a sign on the door of the little closet space that says, please help Mrs. Stubbert wear her suit, because that is what she has worn daily all her life. So she was still wearing her suits, greeting people, sharing everything she knew. And she just was such an amazing person that she touched so many lives. But along this trail, people ask her, can you imagine every time anybody interviewed her, how do you account for the fact that you've lived this long? How do you account for the fact that you're so healthy, that you can go to work? And she said, I don't know. I don't have a clue. She gave the credit to her faith. It was her faith was the only explanation she had. And I have a quote, and I don't want to mess it up. That's why I'm carrying this. She would tell them, faith in a good day's work she had. She had faith in the basic goodness of mankind. And she had faith that tomorrow will come.
We have an opportunity now to help support and preserve sharing Community of Christ heritage. 25 years ago, I was a summer intern working at the Red Brick store in Nauvoo when my future husband walked through the front door. Now, that doesn't happen to everyone, of course, but since that time, I've had the privilege of experiencing interns in either Kirtland or Nauvoo each year. Historic sites have had a profound effect on my life, but I wanted to talk for a moment about the effect it has on the interns and what skills they take with them out into the world. Right away, as they learn the tour, they gain priceless public speaking skills. We've seen interns that couldn't make eye contact at the beginning of the summer flourish with confidence by the time they leave. They also learn budgeting skills as they have to plan out meals, gas, and entertainment on their own, some for the first time. They learn basic business etiquette, like how to answer the phones in a professional way, how to work with the public, and probably most importantly, how to work with and value people of all ages, especially our senior volunteers. The generations can learn so much from each other, and before they know it, they are building Zion together each summer at the sites. And Locke and Barb and I are going to take up your donations now.
was beautiful. Don't we have a great group of storytellers tonight? Locke and Carol, magnificent. I wasn't nervous when I arrived, but after hearing them tell these great stories, now I'm feeling a little nervous. And I think Audrey Stuppert is my new hero. I knew nothing about her until tonight, and thank you, Carol, for sharing her story. What a remarkable woman. Today I want to talk about this adorable baby who turns out to be Alice Smith Edwards. How many of you knew Alice? So a few of you. So she really did exist. That's great. I hope you're willing to share some stories about her. Alice was born at the end of the 19th century. Family was living in Lamoni at the time. Her father was Frederick Madison Smith, and her mother was Ruth Cobb Smith. And the whole church waited with anticipation, with bated breath, for Alice's birth. And why was that? Why were they so excited about the first child of FM and Ruth Cobb Smith? Raise your hand if you're thinking, they wanted a boy. They sure did. And what happens? But Alice is born, a little girl and an adorable girl. But it seems as though as she's born to this chorus of, oh, we so wanted a boy. There's a woman who had written about Alice who said, it's not that Alice did not learn to live within this context. She did, and often quite well, but she acutely knew the pains of being born and reared a princess who never became a queen. She was a remarkable woman, and I want to talk to you a little bit about her tonight. In her childhood, she was surrounded by strong, very intelligent women, and they greatly influenced her. One of those women was her grandmother, Ruth Cobb Smith's mother, Alice Cobb. She made a significant impression on Alice. She was a writer, an adventurer, an activist, a teacher, a poet. She wrote one particularly interesting letter of poetry to Warren G. Harding's wife in 1921. You remember President Harding pleading the case for Native Americans' rights to vote. The letter included 2 stanzas really revealing Alice Cobb's wit and talent. And it appears I might be reading that to you tonight. It reads, if the dusky man's plea meets the nation's approval, and he is permitted a ballot therein, many sneaking white rogues will go out by removal, and our country be reft of much grief and chagrin. I thank you and ask you to mention this letter to him who must first with its contents accede. When red men cast ballots, the world will grow better, and millions, now silent, will shout a Godspeed. So that's her grandmother, and she spent a lot of time with this grandmother because she experienced a sense of love and warmth around this grandmother. She lived with her until she was 5 years old, and she remembered nestling into her grandmother's warm feather bed there in Lamoni during those cold Iowa winter mornings. And thank you. She says, from babyhood, my grandmother taught me to see weird faces and figures in the fluent ivy patterns of our bedroom wall, while she explained such intriguing matters as the intricacies of prosody, semantics, and logic. Logic, she would say, savoring the sound of the word from the Greek logos, the law. Is it any wonder that I could read before I was 3? Just surrounded by intelligent, educated women. Her childhood was filled with that. And Alice was to display an incredible sensitivity to the people and the world around her. Much of that was because of her mother, her grandmother, and many of her aunts. Besides Grandma Cobb and her Smith grandparents who lived at Liberty Hall, Alice was surrounded by family living there in Lamoni. And as a genius child, I think she was particularly genius because she figured out that if she timed it just right, after she finished her evening meal at home, she could sneak out the back door and make it over to Aunt Cattie's house, where she would finish off. Sometimes she said she'd have dinner at one house, make it over to Aunt Cattie's house and have something there. And then she'd sneak on over to another Aunt Bess's house just in time for some dainty, like her creamy batter donuts or a fried or baked chick or whatever it may be. I mean, we have progressive potlucks. She made her own progressive potluck going from one aunt's house to the next. Thank you for advancing the slides back there. Much appreciated. I think this quote really reveals a lot about Alice. Whatever she did passionately and often excessively. When Alice began school, she quickly excelled, and she did so well that the teachers brought her parents in to figure out what they were doing that it had Alice excelling the way that she did. And Fred M. didn't really have a response, but he said that he'd been reading her the newspaper in the morning since the time she was a toddler. So they'd been teaching her and talking to her like an adult ever since she was able to hear their voices. When the family moved to Independence, to the new headquarters of the church, Alice became keenly aware of the not-so-pleasant consequences of being female in the early 1900s. When they moved to Independence, they took the tomboy that Alice was and asked her not to wear her overalls anymore, but now she would have to put on the long-sleeve, heavy dresses. And for her to change that, to begin dressing like a little lady, if you will, was almost a traumatic experience for her. It took her out of her comfort zone. And moving to Independence and having her father in such a high position in the church and her grandfather in such a high position in the church, soon she was in this fishbowl experience. And that was really difficult for her. She felt like all eyes were on her, that people were expecting her to be someone that she wasn't. And she was starting to feel like an oddity, not knowing quite where she fit in. Well, while she was in high school, her father began working on his PhD, and he was attending Clark University, which was out in Massachusetts. And so at the age of 15, at her age of 15, the family moves to Massachusetts, and while he's attending school, they allow her to attend some of the classes with her father. You still with me? At 15, she's attending college with her father while he's working on his PhD. She's attending these lectures, and she finds them intellectually stimulating. Like being around all of these educated people, she's with her people. Even though her age is much younger, she's right in line with them, feels like it intellectually. And while she's there, she begins writing. She begins music and art and really exploring different avenues of who she is as a person. And as she's doing this, her parents are pushing her towards a career in journalism, but she's discovering how much she loves art and how much she loves music, but they convince her otherwise. So she goes off to college, stick to that journalism. You're more likely to find something in that as a writer than you would be as an artist. And she reflects on this later in saying, I don't know whether I would have been a more successful artist or a happier one if I had been free to choose the medium I preferred. But I do know this: when I am writing, I'm oblivious to most interruptions and can concentrate for many hours at a time. But when I paint, I do not stop to eat or sleep. And one of the worst cases of sunburn I ever had, I got trying to catch the afternoon light as it shifted from blue through rose to purple, down the long canyon of the Colorado near Austin, Texas. She was passionate about art. But when she did, after she graduated high school, she attended the Kansas City Junior College and pursued journalism to make her parents proud. And while she was at that junior college, she crossed paths with a man named Virgil Thompson. He was a fellow student. He turns out to later be a well-known composer, music critic, and an author of several books. And the two of them really hit it off. He was not a church member, but intellectually they really connected. And she would invite him over for family dinner quite a bit. And over dinner, the family would invite him to go and play the piano. They'd enjoy his music talents. But oftentimes, her father and her friend Virgil would get together and begin arguing with one another over various topics, politics, or even what was best for Alice. And Alice said, more often than not, Virgil won those arguments in her mind. But in that experience, as the family got to know Virgil, but more specifically as Fred M. got to know Virgil, he learned that Virgil really wanted to get over to Paris. He really wanted to experience Europe and all of the art and the poetry and the history of Europe. There was a bit of a question as to what Virgil's intentions were with Alice, but when Fred M. heard about Virgil's passion to get to Europe, he was able to find a very generous donor that could provide the funds for Virgil to get on over to Europe. And Alice said she said, I wouldn't accuse him, meaning I wouldn't accuse my father of trying to get the fellow out of the way, or would I? So after 2 years at the local junior college, Alice moves to California with her mother. Her mother's health was declining, and the doctors had suggested that the climate of Southern California would be better for her health. And so Alice joined her mother and attended USC, as well as acting as a nurse to her mother to help her get back to better health. And while in California, enrolled at the University of Southern California, she continues to pursue her writing. And after her junior year at USC, she returns back to Independence, and while she's there, she meets a young man named F. Henry Edwards, or Frank. See, isn't he a dashing young man there on the right? And he wins her heart. I think when she meets him, she meets her match. He was just as strongly opinionated as she was, just as educated and intellectual as she was, and the two of them were right at the same level, challenging one another, inspiring one another. He was aggressive and dynamic, and as I mentioned, intelligent, and he supported her, and she felt that he saw her as an equal. Well, despite her love interest being in Independence, she makes her way back to California and attends Stanford University and gets her degree from Stanford University. And while she's out there, it's really, she thinks, the best time of her life, because she's got the security and comfort of knowing her love is with her, but in Independence. She's in an intellectually stimulating environment there on the Stanford campus, and she's living an anonymous life that she had longed for. Nobody knew her as Joseph Smith III's granddaughter or Frederick Madison Smith's daughter. She was able to be herself without any ramifications on the rest of the family, and she loved it. But when it came time for graduation, she wasn't there at her graduation. Instead, she was at the Stone Church marrying this guy. And after she marries him, she becomes, what for many of these women, a woman of the house. Once you get married, there's a plan that you're to be married, you're to be so-and-so's wife, you're to begin having children, and that's your new role. And that was a role she really struggled with. She says that after she got married and had the impression that now it was time for her to stay in the home, she called it the Dark Ages, because she really struggled with that. She began raising a family, and where she focused on the children's life, her husband, his passion was the church, and he was excited and enthusiastic about what was happening at the church. She wanted to get out there just as much as he was. She wanted to continue her writing and her art, but as she's raising children, it's pretty difficult to balance your passions with raising the next generation, and she really struggled with that. In some cases, she assisted her husband with some of the sermons, but in reality, being a mother and being F. Henry Edwards' wife was a full-time job. She found that his wit, his sense of humor, helped during some of the rough times when she felt like she was trapped at home. People would often talk about how cleaning the house, washing, cooking, doing a lot of these duties wasn't exactly her passion. She hated it. Hated to clean and wash and do dishes and cook. Hated it. There was a rumor going around that her kitchen, oftentimes the dirty dishes would just pour out of the sink. And she defended herself, saying, "We don't own enough dishes to fill up the sink and pour out of the sink. That's false. That's false." But she managed to fit in some editorial work for the Herald House and was involved in rewiring or rewriting some of the church's hymns during this time, and was active on the hymnal committee. When World War II hit, she became actively involved in war work. She was a substitute teacher and boarded several students from the juvenile court there at the home. And by the time the war was over, her children were out of the house at this time, and Alice found a tremendous vacuum to fill now that she was no longer raising children, and wondering what it was that she was going to do. And one night, her and Frank, as she called him, he said to her somewhat sarcastically if she had read anything decent lately. And she began to realize that she hadn't picked up a book in a really long time. And she loved to read books, but she realized she hadn't picked up a book in years. And partially to spite him, she said, for his remark, because he had challenged her, well, maybe you just can't read a book any longer. It's been so long. So to challenge him, she picks up an old book by a big, thick, 400-page book by a Greek philosopher, and is like, I'll show you, you just watch this. Well, as she started reading the book, she became tired, began losing her attention, really felt like she had gotten out of the routine of reading this book, and it bothered her. And around the same time, that old friend of hers, Virgil, had asked her if she was having any fun, and she realized she just wasn't. She wasn't getting out. She wasn't surrounding herself by the intellectuals that had stimulated her for so long, and she realized she needed to do something. And she does. She goes back to school. She begins teaching night classes in English and speech for some of the war veterans who are returning home. And this next chapter in her life, she really comes alive. She feels this calling to be in the classroom as a teacher, helping those veterans who are returning from the war. She said, for the first time in my life, I was without any domestic responsibility, and I loved it. Soon she received a master's degree in English language and literature. That's in 1958. And she continues helping veterans while earning that degree. And I think one great example of her helping, she began teaching at the University of Kansas City, and she taught 7 to 8 sections of English 1, 3 to 4 sections of English 2, and 2 courses in creative writing. I mean, she's just on fire during this later period in her life. And a great example of the impact that she had on some of these veterans returning from war was a gentleman named Edward Chapin. It's C-H-A-P-I-N. And Ed came from a very poor background, and he served as a member of a bombing crew in Italy during the war. His plane was shot down over Poland. His right arm was hurt very severely. He was held as a prisoner of war for some time and finally released to come back home because of his injuries. He came back home injured, disillusioned, angry, and with no one to turn to. So he was encouraged to begin attending night classes, and it was during a night class that he crossed paths with Alice, and it was purely by accident. He went into her classroom and sat down, and as she began to teach, he realized he thought he was in an accounting class. He had gone into the wrong class, and here he was in her English class. But by that point, he was so apathetic, he thought, I'm going to take an English class then. And he sat in and was fascinated by her, was intrigued by her. His enrollment in that class had a great impact on her. For a long time, Ed refused to talk or write anything. Not only was his mind in revolt, but his damaged right hand couldn't even hold a pen. And the childlike scribbles that he would make with his left hand, he was humiliated by. But within Ed, Alice found inspiration with him. She wanted to hear his story, and she worked on him to open up. Alice was able to help Ed heal his wounds from the war by encouraging his wit, recognizing his sensitivity, spending one-on-one time with him. He started writing of his experience in Italy, started writing of his experience in the Polish prison camp, and his experience in the Air Force. And by writing all of this out, it was a therapeutic experience for him as she was able to help him unlock that side of him that he had kept suppressed for so long. One of his first poems that he had submitted in a class exercise moved Alice so profoundly that she couldn't sleep after reading it. And she began writing immediately, trying to get all of her emotions down or under control. She was so impacted by him. There was this awakened genius, she thought, that happened within Ed, and he soon began going to school full-time. He graduated from Kansas City University with a bachelor's degree in English and journalism. He got a job with the Kansas City paper. He later relocated to New York City and began working for the New York Times, and he was just one of her success stories. She found this connection with those people who felt like they couldn't fit in, the oddities and the outcasts. And perhaps that was something subconsciously where she felt like she struggled to fit in much of her life that gave her that sensitivity to help those looking to find their place in the world. Her life was dedicated to helping those other voices be heard. And she was one of those rare teachers who could especially relate and react to the reluctant and troubled student, kind of like Ed Chapin. One of the faculty members she worked with described her skills as a teacher, and they said of her, "A quality that has contributed to make your classes outstanding is the unerring ability with which you have read each student's needs and recognized the personal interferences which have held him or her back in check or frustrated experience or talent. Then for each one, you have included generous gifts of patience, good humor, keen wit, and a deep well of sympathy for personal blocks, narrowness of concepts, and dimness." So here in these years of her life, as she finds that calling through education and through her writing, she finds herself no longer being someone's granddaughter, being Joseph Smith III's granddaughter, or F. Henry Ward's wife, or F.M. Smith's daughter. Here she was, Alice, in her own right, and making significant impacts on others, in her students and people in the church, and certainly inspiring those who felt like they didn't have a voice. She continued on strong until her death in 1973. And that's Alice Smith Edwards. So tonight we have heard a lot of stories about women in church history, but now is the opportunity for you to share a story about a woman that has touched your life or has inspired you, or perhaps whose life was a lesson to you that you'd like to share with the group.
To moderate this part. And so while you're thinking about who wants to share, I'll share a quick story. I'm not a very good storyteller, but my grandmother, who I wasn't very, I didn't get to spend a lot of time with her, but before I was born, she took her family from Florida and traveled to Alaska, and on their way back, it was 1959, they stopped here in Independence, and they were just finishing the installment of the organ, and the workers turned around and said, "Does anybody play the organ?" And my grandmother was a very accomplished musician, played lots of instruments, and she said, "I can." So I need to go back now, I realize, and ask people that were there, what did she play? So it's just kind of neat to be able to go to the auditorium and think about somebody that is in my life. So who else would like to share a story? Because I have no more.
I'd like to continue in Audrey Stubbert's story if I could. Audrey and I started at the Independence Examiner on the same day. She was 65, I was 15. And she was just almost like an aunt. We were close. But I have a couple of funny stories, I think, to tell about it. Pete Esser was the editor of the Examiner at the time I was there, and her. And it was well known that the only two people who could holler, "Stop the presses," was Pete Esser or Audrey Stubbert. Pete, if he saw something wrong with the story or something wrong with what was being done. Audrey, if she saw some grammatical errors. But one day there was a situation where there were two stories in the paper. One story was about a young women's swimming group and had a lot of young women in their swimsuits. Another story about a women's group at a country club. and they were all older women, dressed in their finery at the country club. Well, unfortunately, the stories were switched with pictures. And they love to kind of dig Audrey about that, and Audrey let them know that, look, I looked at the type, the stories. It's not my job to figure out which picture goes there. But from that day forward, whenever she would review something that was a caption for a picture, she would put a note on it. This goes on the sports page. This goes on. She wasn't going to let that happen again. She was just a very, very fine woman. I really enjoyed working with her.
Thank you.
I have a question for Locke. Section 24 of the Doctrine and Covenants, I'd like to know when that was given relative to Emma's baptism and her confirmation, because I kind of understood that it was given between those two events. And if that is the case, then I'm wondering if that ordination was to the office of member. And that says something to us about the office of member.
That's a great question. I don't know, but I'll find out.
I do have another story about Alice Edwards, which I've told before, but in case some people were not here at that time, Alice had served on the General Council of Women at one point. And when I became Commissioner of Women's Ministries, I learned that the tradition was when a person passed who had been on the commission or the council or who was related to a member of the Joint Council, it was common for the present General Council of Women to sit together at the funeral or the memorial service. And so this happened, and so people said that I should call Speak's funeral home and tell them and find out how we organize this. This was the first time it had happened in my term of leadership. And so he said, well, the funeral's going to be at Stone Church, and when your people arrive, tell them that you're with the council and they'll seat you in the proper place. So we did. Well, it happens that they took us in and they sat us on the right side of the Stone Church, there in that part that extends over. Well, I guess we got there before the Joint Council, and that's really where the Joint Council was supposed to sit. So they started bringing the Joint Council in. They saw us, then they'd go, oh, and then they would go and they'd take them over to the left side. So that was fine. The Joint Council sat on the left, we sat on the right. When it came time for the honorary pallbearers to be escorted out, who were the Joint Council, nobody had told the deacons about the switch of the seating arrangements. And so they came and got us. And so the General Council women went out and were the honorary pallbearers for Alice. And then they figured out what had happened, and so then they went and got the Joint Council, and they had to walk through us to form then the next thing. And then the coffin was brought out, and then the family. And F. Henry stood there on the stairs, and he says, I don't know how this happened, but Alice is up there doing her thing, and she got her honors how she wanted it.
Thank you. I know there's more.
Baptized June 28 of 1830, Section 24, July of 1830. Oh. I don't know, but I'll find out.
You think? Who else would like to share?
I'm a graduate of the Independent Sanitarium and Hospital, and Alice was our English and communications teacher our freshman year. So that was kind of a new experience for me to sit, and she always would sit right on the front row. She never stood up front. She always just sat right on the front row and conducted her class, and we would have to get up and give our writings and read them before the class. But and I don't know how long she was an instructor there, but she was there my year when I entered in the fall of '63.
Okay, I'm going to give you a last chance. Well, if nobody else would like to share, I want to thank you for coming tonight. And be sure and join us in the back for goodies. There's the bake sale and the other things that are available. And thank you to the group that was playing today. And thank you to all the storytellers. I really enjoy nights like this. Thank you. So let's go forward and tell more stories, and let's live those stories that we are making today and the rest of our lives. Thank you.